Hey guys, Connor coming to you from the World Divide. Today we're going to give a November 6th update on the Russo-Ukraine War. Um, I would just like to say, just starting right off the bat, there are very minimal movements on the front lines as of currently. Um, there are rumors that the Wagner forces have broken through a line of defense in and around Bakhmut. Unconfirmed. Lots of fog of war in that region. Moving further south to Luglidar front, there have been some reports by Ukrainian sources that Russians had heavy losses there, suffered, you know, undesirable casualty ratio in that area. Um, of course, uh, still kind of unconfirmed. We're actually hearing some Russian sources relay this information as well. So I think in the next couple days we'll kind of hear more on that. But I immediately want to move past the Zaporozhye line, everything. I want to talk about Kherson. So a few days ago I believed that there is a high possibility that a large offensive actions could take place here. Now I believe that it's definitely going to happen, and it's going to be based on, or it's very likely going to be based on the November 8th midterm election timeline for the United States. So now the Joe Biden presidency has a really important decision to make. I think with the numbers that we're seeing now, it's looking like the Democratic Party will likely lose the Senate and the House to the Republicans. Likely. So in that case, we're seeing, I think, a lot more pressure from the Biden administration on Ukraine to start offensive actions. It wouldn't be in Ukraine's best interest to start these offensive actions, but it would be good for the Biden administration, I think. So we're seeing large troop buildups in Ukraine around the Kherson region for quite possibly a very large showdown. Currently, there's a lot of artillery, hammering away at Russian positions right now, in kind of a footing that's reminiscent of preparations for a large-scale offensive. Usually, you would want to shell the hell out of the enemy's positions before preparing for an advance. So there's only a few more days until we find out what's really kind of going on here. Still a lot of fog of war, a lot that's really confusing right now, especially with the information war running really hot right now, with talks of the coalition of the willing from retired U.S. General Prudushev. I talked about this a little bit briefly in my last video, but it certainly raises some really high concerns that the United States may find the idea of deploying troops to Western Ukraine a good one, which it is not. It's foolish. And I've been criticizing the United States more and more because it's become more and more apparent that the United States is acting similarly to as the British and the French did at their colonial heights. And the reason I say that is because all the wars that we have fought in the last 30 years, right, they've been nothing. They've been absolutely nothing compared to Russia, right? We're basically moving into countries that, have small insurgencies or disorganized terrorist groups, militaries, things of that nature. Things that we don't really have to pay much attention to, even put much effort in. The Afghanistan war, yeah, we lost a lot of money in that war, but we were fighting Taliban insurgents. This is the Russian military. And we'd be heavily outnumbered if we had a coalition of the willing, assuming that the Romanians joining the Slovaks. Most promising the Poles. The Poles have quite a grudge against Russia. We might be looking at a troop concentration with U.S. troops making up around 40,000. with a combined force of, say, around 150,000 troops. Now, the Russians would target the United States forces immediately. They are the linchpin of NATO. They are the linchpin of everything that's been happening in Ukraine, intelligence, all these things. Our involvement has been very heavy. So the Russians will take out the United States forces. And what happens then? When U.S. soldiers start coming back in coffins, and where that escalates to. So, for this war not to escalate to a global war, it must ensure that U.S. troops never even set foot in Ukraine. Granted, we have contractors already on the ground. This is true for a lot of NATO countries. They have a lot of contractors dressed in civilian clothing, kind of in higher up positions, doing command and control tasks, teaching Ukrainians how to use certain advanced equipment that's been transferred from the West. So that's kind of the purpose of a lot of those contractors that come into Ukraine. Talking more about kind of Ukraine's energy security. I don't even want to use the word security. It's looking really dire for Ukraine. There was just an announcement today that if Kiev loses power, they may have to evacuate the whole city, and that the possibility for Ukrainians evacuating many major cities across the nation is a high possibility. Because just last night, or the night before, might be mixing them up, there was a large-scale Russian strike. Around 100 missiles, another wave of strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. After every single strike, the severity of the situation for the Ukrainians gets more and more serious for them. It's continually escalating. So now we're looking at the possibility of Ukraine not having the tools necessary to survive winter. Russia building up hundreds of thousands of troops all along the border from Belarus all the way down to Kherson. Ukraine's best shot is to drive the Russians from the Kherson bridgehead. Try to anchor in the Dnieper River to at least slow down the Russians. Give them a little bit more time. Because this war isn't ending. Peace negotiations were supposed to happen back in March and April. 8 months in, and because of the decisions of the United States, the UK, and ultimately Volodymyr Zelensky deciding to go along with those decisions, that has led us to where we are now, to where Russia is in a more war-footing stance. And they're doing a lot. Vladimir Putin himself is doing a lot of the things that he restrained himself from doing earlier in the war. I mean, if we look back in February, March, we had around 200,000 troops entering in Ukraine in small group formations, almost in lines. Really, the configuration of the Russian armed forces was not necessarily to occupy the entirety of Ukraine, but to force Kiev to peace negotiations, force them to a peace settlement. And that happened. That happened. Until the Russians pulled out. Boris Johnson visited Kiev, and then the situation changed after that. So here we are. Things are at a breaking point. Ukraine is falling apart. Like I said in my last video, November 8th is the day to watch. What happens in the United States affects the way this war plays out. And if we're able to get to peace negotiations, that may be the difference between a Ukraine surviving as an independent state, an independent country, or Ukraine ceasing to exist at all. And unfortunately, with the persistence that we've had in this, the latter of the two options is highly more likely. But that's all I have to say today about November 6th. Yeah, not much going on the front lines, but The Kherson region, I think, would be a region to watch. Zaporozhye region would be a region to watch. We should see some larger scale offensive operations and movements very, very soon. I think the preparations are almost done, and I think Ukraine's time is almost up. Let's just wait to see how quickly the weather cools down. Let's see how quickly the ground hardens and it becomes easy to move heavy equipment and other things like that across fields, any type of terrain, instead of mud that bogs down heavy equipment and makes it difficult for large-scale offensive actions to take place. So we'll wait and see what happens. My hopes aren't currently high for Ukraine, and it seems the more severe Ukraine's situation seems to get, the more Western media sources tend to double down on the fact that Ukraine is winning. They've been preaching this for the entirety of the 8 months. Where's the evidence of that happening? I don't see any evidence of that happening. I see Russia wiping out Ukrainian energy infrastructure. I see Ukrainian economy falling off a cliff. I see Russian troops mobilized to the point where Ukraine has near to no possibility of large-scale offensive actions and of any kind. I see Western support failing. I see protests all over Europe. I don't see the situation going good for us. But what you see online will tell you otherwise. Take a look at the reality of the situation and you'll understand. That's all I have for you guys today. I'll keep you updated for next time. Thank you.